Hey everybody, welcome to Gender, Race, and Media, Week 2, our first week of discussing readings, and a lot of people have requested Rupert. As you can see, he's sort of camera shy. He doesn't really want to be on camera. He'd much rather be seeing you in person, and I suppose that's understandable. But yeah, no, I tried. Okay, so this is why he's not on camera as often as he used to be, although maybe that'll change. Maybe he'll get more used to things. Anyway, let's get started. We got lots of cool stuff to talk about today. Okay, so this week we are talking about Batman and the Joker, and yours truly. I told you earlier that I want to talk about gender and sexuality and all the other things we're going to talk about through the lens of a superhero or different superheroes, because it's easier to apply these things, and it's also kind of easier to apply these things to cultural phenomena that we see and that we're vaguely familiar with, if not, big fans of it. And that way it makes it a little easier than always talking about ourselves or our own experiences. Instead, looking at something like Batman, which has existed, or the character has existed since the late 1930s, we can see changes already, even though that's, for our lives, it's a big time period, but for civilization, for Western culture, that's a very small time period. But we can see variations in how gender and sexuality, in this case, have been performed and have been represented. And so that's why I want to do this. So I'm also going to talk about this reading, which I hope wasn't too tedious or anything. Like I said, it's a small one. It'll introduce a number of things we're going to talk about in terms of gender and sexuality. But I want to sort of model, as I talk to you today, what I want future students to do, because from now on, starting next week, some of you are going to lead the discussion. So we are either going to be in person, or we are going to be doing it where we will interact at the same time rather than just these videos from next week on, because I want to have discussion. I saw the roster, a lot of great people, you know who you are, who are taking this class. I look forward to discussing things with you. It's kind of weird not to be able to discuss things now with this book, because that was my intention when I originally planned for this. I won't get into my thoughts on the administration and their planning of COVID and how we... So anyway, this is what I want you to do when you take on a reading of your own. So you'll choose this week which reading you're going to direct. And so all you have to do is, of course, read whatever the text is, but then have some things planned. So for starters, I want you to have a brief introductory activity or question or something that can get the discussion going right away that week. So again, I'm trying to model it with this. So let me ask you. Question number 1, and there's sort of associated questions with this. Are Batman and Robin gay? So I want you to think about that. I want you to try to answer that, hopefully after having read this. And then question number 2 associated with that is, why is it that people for about 80 years now have been talking about whether Batman and Robin are gay? I think that probably is more interesting than whether he or they are or aren't, because first of all, they're characters, right? So can a character really be straight or gay or what? Because you can rewrite them. It's not like there's some true Batman out there, right? That you can just say, yeah, I saw him the other day and he's told me he's gay, right? He can come in various representations. He can come on TV. He can come on film, and of course in comic books. And so we have all these different representations, but it's always the same sort of character, even though sometimes he might be sort of more masculine, sometimes he might be more flamboyant, sometimes he might be more child-friendly for a younger audience, and sometimes he's more dark and brooding for perhaps an older audience. And so that's one of the interesting things about Batman. As I said, if you like Batman, great, we can talk. And if you don't, it's totally okay. You're not going to offend me by saying, I don't watch any of those films and I haven't read any of those comic books. You will, for this class, read at least one comic book. But anyway, why have people worried about this? Why have people discussed this? If you read this book, you know now that early on, he was introduced as a as a child's comic. Most, if not all, comics were for children. And as things gradually got more popular, as comics in general got more popular, people started to worry about kids not reading good books, and instead they were reading comics. And then one psychiatrist in particular, Frederick Wortham, said that basically Batman and Robin were representatives of a homosexual lifestyle. They live together, they pretty much sleep together, they do all of these things that intimate partners, intimate lovers might do. And so it's setting up kids to have these sort of fantasies or to live out these fantasies. And of course, at that time in the 50s, being gay was the same as being mentally ill or a criminal. It was not a good thing, right? That was the common sentiment. And so it's not like today you might say, and I think in this book you might get the impression like, yeah, maybe Batman's gay and that would be cool. That was not obviously the case in the 50s. So, but why was that such a big deal? And that goes to something we're going to be talking about throughout the course, which is these representations are important for how we tell our community, like the larger community, the larger culture, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is appropriate, not appropriate. And so obviously representations of gender and race, which we're going to focus on, are really important for getting to questions of identity and what is acceptable and not acceptable, and that obviously changes throughout time. That's why I would be interested, and I think we continue to be interested in this question. It's not so much like, is Batman gay or not? Ultimately, that's stupid, who cares? But why have people looked into that? Why have they worried about that? What is the purpose of that? That gets into a lot more nuanced arguments about probably much more important things. What would it mean if he was or wasn't? What would it do to our society? These are questions that obviously relate to a bunch of different things. So that's one thing. I would start, if we were having a real discussion, like it wasn't just a recorded video, we would debate this a little bit. So when it comes time for your presentations, I hope that you can introduce a question or an activity that we can debate. And then you want to introduce the author. So in this case, you're looking at him. I hope actually to have some of the other authors Skype in or do a brief talk for us, so I'll let you know about that. But in this case, yeah, it's kind of easy. I can point you to the author's background and credentials. He did a Master's of Popular Culture in Ontario, and then he did a PhD in Media Studies, and his work has primarily been on representations of gangs and crime and popular culture. So he's written about Kanye West back before Kanye was totally off the walls. He's written about gangs, of course, and crime and representations of crime. Has a few books out on violence and on habitus, which is a sort of theoretical concept applied to the hood, which is a representation of marginalized communities. That was my first edited collection that I did with my supervisor. And so that's kind of my background: journalism, mass media, popular culture, and cultural studies. Presented back before COVID and everything at Comic-Con in San Diego. That was actually a talk on, what was that a talk on? That was a talk on Jessica Jones, on her representation as a female superhero and where she comes into this symbolic capital I was talking about. But anyway, you do want to introduce the author, especially anything relevant, right? So if the author was a big activist in one area, or the author has published primarily in this area, you want to introduce that because that can be important for all of the readings. So after doing that, you want to set up what are the most important things of the reading. So in this case, it's kind of a big reading because there are 3 major chapters, but it comes down to, I would say, representations and performances of gender and sexuality. So let's just break that down for a minute. So I use Bruce Wayne and Batman, you could say that they're one and the same, to think about how we have, as a society, especially in American popular culture, represented gender and sexuality, right? So early on, Bruce Wayne would be having a pipe, he would be in a lounge jacket, he would be what we would call, I think today, by most popular standards and conventions, a sort of a feminine man. He was, a effete, rich playboy who kind of went out on the town but didn't really do much, and so we know from reading the comics, if you read the comics, and I'm sure you are aware of this anyway, that he's just pretending sort of to do that so that he can do what his real passion is, which is fighting crime as Batman. And so in order to do that, he doesn't want to look strong and smart. He wants to look like a sort of rich loser, and that allows him to have that other identity. And so he's always performing, and he sort of performs these two things, right? He performs what a man of his time ought to do, it seems, from the dominant culture. So again, he's going out on dates, he's going out to parties, he's, smoking and lounging and doing whatever a man of his time is supposed to do. Today, if you think about different people, the Christian Bale Batman became very popular with the Christopher Nolan films. He was sort of more macho, more of a contemporary man. Maybe you'd call him a metrosexual, or someone who is, concerned with superficial things. I'm talking about the persona that he has. And then, of course, Batman is a much sort of harder, grisly. He even does that voice, which I won't mimic, but it's kind of, I don't know, kind of like as if you were trying to be a real man's man, heteronormative guy. And so we can see how he performs these things, and I think that's a key to understanding how we all perform these things, right? So I'm obviously performing some version of masculinity. If you're somebody who grew up wearing camo and hunting deer, then I probably seem very feminine to you. But if you're somebody who, I don't know, grew up in a queer household where people were much more open, then maybe I seem somewhat repressed and heteronormative, and there's all these variations, right? And it comes from your background, your cultural background, as well as the expectations that we sort of adopt as we watch films, as we read books. These are all ways that we sort of internalize what it means to be a man or a woman or what have you, what it means to be straight or not, and then we act these things out and we perform them. So Judith Butler, an important figure, she talks about how drag performances are, perfect examples of performativity. So if you go to a drag performance, which I hope you have or you get to if you haven't, usually they're really fun and accepting environments, primarily because nobody has that baggage, like I need to be a manly man and don't you talk to me and I'm going to put on this like rough persona. Everyone's just kind of free. At least that's been my experience going to some of these shows. And like I said, it's very different than if you were, say, I've never been to like an NRA convention, but I would imagine that those are quite different. And based on the advertisements where it says stuff like, consider your man card reissued if you buy this Bushmaster, that's a very different environment than a drag show. But both, and everything in between, are performing gender and sexuality, masculinity in this case usually, or femininity. And so a drag show typically has a person who would probably identify as a man, often a gay man, but not necessarily. And that person is performing what is usually a heteronormative female, right? And so we can see that there is a performance going on. It's usually called a drag performance. And so that allows us to say like, okay, so there's the difference between, a lot of people want to say like there's a biological, that's how you were born, and then there's the way you act. And, we could get into that, but basically you could say this person is acting in a way that we all understand is usually the way that traditional feminine people act, all right? And so, maybe he sings a Madonna song or a Miley Cyrus or does something where the man clearly is acting like a woman. And so if you look at these historical ideas of what is a man, what is a woman, the person has flipped that. That's usually what a drag performance looks like. Batman, though, is doing the same thing, and you and I are doing the same thing. You are usually not doing it, and it varies, of course, but we're usually not doing it as a whole in such a dramatic twist, right? Where it's like, I identify as a man, I'm now going to identify as a woman in this persona. Instead, we usually confuse the two because we think that they're the same, right? So there's this person who is Chris, and then there's this performance who is Chris, and oftentimes, at least in my head and probably in your head, they're the same thing, right? So we don't see a flip or a twist. But it's still a performance, and that's part of the important thing that you might get from this, I hope, and also from Butler's work and others, is that we are all performing our gender and sexuality. It's just that if we think that it's natural, we don't realize or we don't think of it as a performance. But then once you start to unpack it, you realize, yeah, that's definitely a performance, right? None of us were born wearing suits or talking in a certain way or joining I don't know, queer clubs or the NRA or any of these associations, right? Like these are social bodies and social conventions that we learn from, and then we can either say like, yeah, I'm like that, or I'm not like that. But these choices that we make, and sometimes they feel natural, sometimes they feel like, conventional choices, like, oh, I better do this because that's what is expected of me. It's all performance. You're performing, I'm performing. According to Butler, and again, it's up to you to decide how much you sort of agree or you want to buy into this, but you can keep falling back on the person performing, and underneath there's always just another person performing, right? So you could be like, I'm Chris and that's real. He's performing, or I'm performing a heteronormative man right now. But if you strip away that performance, then underneath there's this, but that thing is performing too. Like you never get to a bottom, right? If you imagine those Russian dolls, you keep opening up more and more performers, really. So we're all performers. That's part of what this is about. And then if you take the Joker often represents the opposite of the sort of heteronormative performance, where the Joker is more like that drag queen, right? More willing to say, I don't believe that you have to act the way that you're assigned at birth or anything like that. I'm going to perform this today and that tomorrow, and you'll never catch me, right? That's sort of the idea. And it's not, I don't think, a coincidence, or at least that's the argument that I make, that he's the bad guy. Because we often see, like, if you conform to the standard heteronormative practices of your culture, you're the good guy. And if you don't, you're the bad guy. And that sends a strong message, right? That you should be doing this, or else you're more like the Joker. You don't want to be more like the Joker. Things change in different ways, but we can see that for a long time. I mean, if you think about the last couple hundred years in America, if you were gay, you could easily be killed, murdered by the state, executed, because you were going against God's will or whatever. In the same way that witches were prosecuted, and in the same way that, murderers would be prosecuted, right? So there was this confluence of, if you're not heteronormative, and obviously these are terms that we're applying back then, they wouldn't necessarily say it like this, but if you're not heteronormative following what we think a man should be like, you might as well be a witch, or you might as well be a murderer, or all of these bad things, right? So they're all grouped together. And so we get a lot of bad guys, at least in traditional representations up until more recent times, like the 2000s, and even still it happens. It's more rare than it was in the 60s, say. But yeah, bad guys are often queer representatives of queer culture as well, and so that's not a coincidence. It also allows people like Batman and Bruce Wayne, the good guys, to look better, right? To look more heteronormative, to look more unquestionably manly, because there's that other bad guy who's acting flamboyant or who's breaking these conventions. So it makes the other person look more conventional. That's something that we've had for a very long time. If you've taken another class, Intro to Media Literacy with me, you know about folk devils. Queer representatives of an alternative culture, sexual and gender representation, are often seen as folk devils, and they're painted literally as like devils, as bad witchcraft people, whatever, to make the other people seem more sort of normal and better, right? You need those people. And the Joker and Batman have this dynamic where they're sort of the same, but they're also the opposite, and that line comes in and out, as I discuss in the book. And that's a strong representative, or it runs in parallel to all of the other things going on in our culture. So it's not just about, the Joker and Batman. It's about how our culture represents people who are quote unquote normal and abnormal when it comes to gender and sexual representation and activity and all the ways that we describe ourselves and others. So that's an important thing to consider. And the only other thing I want to talk about now, I wish we had more time, and I hope that we will continue to talk about these things into the future. So don't think like this is the one and only time we can talk about this, because hopefully next week it'll come up in our conversation and continue to. But the other idea that I want to discuss a little bit is just the idea of queer reading. So first off, it's interesting that the older you are, like I'm talking, if I was having a discussion with someone who's in their 60s, and they were saying how queer was the same as saying a bunch of other slurs, sort of, right? It's a very bad word, basically. It's what you would say to somebody to show how much you hate them, usually how homophobic you are. Today we have queer studies. You can get a PhD in certain schools in queer studies. And so it's clearly not a bad word now, although it can be, right? It depends how you want to use it as well. So if you're using it in the sense that, I dislike you and your practices because you're a queer, that's a bad thing, and I definitely wouldn't recommend doing that. But then there's an alternative where you can study what it means to be sort of normal, and what these representations of normalcy and these expectations and these conventions are, and how we can read it sometimes against the grain, in an alternative way, but also just how we can kind of unpack these meanings that we tend not to speak about. That can also be what we would call a queer reading, right? So you could say, for example, what if we just assume that Batman is gay and go from there? That might be a queer reading. Or what if we ask ourselves what really is going on between Batman and his female companions, which is sort of what I do in that first chapter. That can also be a queer reading. And so there are a bunch of ways that you can do queer reading, but really it's about questioning what are the norms and the assumptions in this society and what needs to be in place. So in this case, a sort of heteronormative ideology needs to be in place for any of this to make sense. And as soon as you start to sort of unpack that, sometimes you could call it deconstruction, then you start to see how that heteronormative ideology works, and you start to ask more interesting questions, right? So you could listen to discourses that we might see, in certain places around here, where people are like, a man is born a man and a woman is born a woman. And a queer reading doesn't necessarily have to say, no, you're wrong or something, but it would, at least in my opinion, it would ask like, okay, well, what do you mean? And what do you need to know? And, think about it. Just in my other class, talked about knowledge and power, Foucault's idea that if you have power, you can do knowledge, or you can have knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you can have more power. And those two things go together, right? The more powerful you are, the more you can say what's real. So what power do you need in order to say what a man is? What power do you need and knowledge do you need in order to say what a man, a woman should do, right? Who gets to say that? How do they get to say that? These are sort of queer questions because they're queering the norm, you could call it, or they're simply, interrogating things that if you were to just subscribe to the dogmatic sort of principles, then you would never ask these questions, right? And that would be in line with that ideology. Queer reading, generally speaking, I would say, and it's open to interpretation, asks the questions that you're not supposed to ask, at least if you follow the dominant ideology, right? So I think we should all do more queer readings and experiment with our understanding, as opposed to just saying, well, a man's a man, like what else is there? There's a lot there, obviously. But it can be very uncomfortable, of course, because I'm sure even some of you, if you tell your parents or grandparents that you're taking a class where you're learning about queer studies, they would start to get upset. A queer reading, though, would ask, why are they getting upset? What is it that upsets them? And oftentimes I think, like doing these tests that I've given you from Harvard about the implicit biases, it can reflect, your fears or your worries, whether that's, I don't want to be queer because that's a bad thing and that's how I grew up to understand it, or I don't want to be homophobic, but maybe I have some internalized homophobia. Even if you are gay or you represent yourself as queer, you might still be homophobic, and that can be really troubling too, because, that's how our society kind of trains us. There's so much to talk about. I've given you a number of things to think about, I hope, with the reading, but also with the questions online this week. Next week, we will have somebody, whoever signs up for it, and if nobody signs up, I guess it'll be me, introduce the reading. I want to leave you with some resources, and that's the other thing that you should do when you wrap up. So in this case, you can just click on the Batman link in this website, and you can see other lectures I've given, other things. And in the future, when you're talking about an author and their work, you can maybe provide some links or provide some places for people to check out or videos for people to check out if they want to know more about that person, that reading. So that's how I hope that you'll sort of lead a lecture or lead a discussion. It doesn't have to be a lecture. In fact, I don't want it to be like this. I want us to be able to talk to each other. And so you don't need to plan an hour. You need to plan like 20 minutes, and the rest should hopefully be a great discussion. I look forward to talking to you all. I will let you know how things go in terms of what we're planning for the weeks ahead. but we will either meet in person or we will meet online and have an actual discussion, and I look forward to doing that. In the meantime, take care. Rupert is hiding. He doesn't want to come back, but maybe he'll be back next week. Cheers.